This is Guns Unpacked, a podcast where we interrogate, engage, and elevate the terms of the gun debate as we know it. I am your host, Jennifer Carlson, the director of the Center for the Study of Guns in Society at Arizona State University. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Andrew C. McKevitt. Dr. McKevitt, can I call you Drew?
Yes, please do call me Drew.
Awesome. So Drew is the John D. Winters Endowed Professor of History at Louisiana Tech University, where he has taught since 2012. Drew is the author of two books, Consuming Japan, Popular Culture and the Globalizing of America, which was published in 2017, and then Gun Country, Gun Capitalism, Culture, and Control in Cold War America, which was published in 2023. And both of these were published by the University of North Carolina Press. I am so thrilled that we are here to discuss Gun Country. It was actually named one of the top 50 notable nonfiction books in 2023 by the Washington Post. It's been widely covered, widely praised for its incisive and very innovative look at the history of American gun politics. So, Drew, you open the book with a vignette that I think does a really interesting and compelling job of connecting your past research with the present book topic of gun capitalism and gun consumerism. You started out as a scholar of Japan, a scholar of consumerism. Can you tell us how you fell into studying American gun culture from that background?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. And first, thanks so much for having me, Jenny. I really appreciate this. You know how much I admire your work. And so I'm so glad you're doing this. And I'm thrilled myself that I've been invited to do this with you. I was actually trained as a historian of U.S. foreign relations. I wasn't trained to do gun history. In fact, very few historians are trained to do gun history formally, although that's changing quite a bit. So my initial research interests way back in graduate school was in stuff like the Cold War. That's how I ended up writing a book on U.S.-Japan relations in the 1970s and the 1980s. So I was a historian of culture and its intersections with foreign relations. And I was working on that book when I got my first job in Louisiana back in 2012. And when I arrived here, I was curious about the connections between my new home and the subject I'd been working on for so many years. Because part of the argument of that book is that we can find foreign relations happening in these informal ways in spaces around the country, like in auto assembly factories and anime fan clubs and things like that. And so it began with something as simple and almost as embarrassing as a Google search for like Louisiana and Japan. And so I came across this case that I knew nothing about, which was the 1992 shooting death of Yoshi Hattori, 16-year-old Japanese exchange student who shot to death in Baton Rouge in 1992 when he is out looking for a Halloween party and knocks on the wrong door. White woman answers, sees a Japanese teenager dressed up in a silly costume, screams, slams the door, yells for her husband to get the gun. He rushes to the closet and he pulls out a .44 Magnum Smith & Wesson, which he uses to confront Yoshi in the driveway. A minute later, and Yoshi approaches him, trying to explain that they're looking for a party. He yells, "Freeze!" Yoshi doesn't seem to understand, and he pulls the trigger, and Yoshi's dead a few minutes later. The thing that was really remarkable to me is how this became an international incident. Because again, I'm studying U.S.-Japan relations here, and I hadn't heard of this. It makes national news, but it also becomes an international incident in the sense that the Japanese people are looking at this case and they're saying, what on earth happened here? What kind of society allows someone to open the front door armed with the most powerful handgun ever made and confront an unarmed child and shoot and kill him and get away with it? Because by May of the following year, the killer is acquitted. So I started thinking about gun history from the start as a kind of international story, or at least trying to understand American gun culture and politics and consumerism eventually in a global context. And so that got me asking a lot of questions about the history of the United States and its guns in a global context. And at first I thought I'd write a kind of micro history of Yoshi and the Baton Rouge and Louisiana in the 1980s and 1990s, but it drove me much further back than that, all the way back to the end of the Second World War and the way in which the United States global engagement after the end of the Second World War helped create, I argue, the kind of gun culture we know today.
One thing that I really appreciate, and you just sort of mentioned it, that there is not enough gun history. This is across the social sciences that, more scholars being engaged in this topic would really benefit us from a variety of perspectives with respect to understanding and addressing the issue of guns in American society. And so, there's people like me who are, everything I do is gun related. So I really think I sit squarely in the gun scholar box. Then you have scholars like you who are kind of get drawn into this topic and then start unraveling it and get deeper and deeper. And then boom, we have this amazing canonical book that you produce on gun capitalism. And so, I'm curious, what do you wish you would have known, I guess, before you went down this path of gun scholarship? What's been surprising to you that you've encountered on this kind of diversion away from, maybe what you thought you were going to be studying when you were doing your graduate studies?
Yeah, gosh, there's a lot of ways to answer that question. So yeah, I do live now in a kind of gun culture, right? And I think, we can make the argument, and others have made the argument, that there are a lot of gun cultures in the United States, plural. And the one I live in here in North Louisiana is one that is very much oriented around hunting consumerism and that sort of thing. So surely you are familiar with the Duck Dynasty people, for example. They are just down the road from us, and this is Duck Dynasty country. In fact, some of them are alums of the institution where I teach. In some ways I expected and anticipated the kind of local reaction I would get from beginning to work on a project like this. And I knew there were going to be people who were unhappy that I'd even take up regardless of what I ended up writing, that a college professor would even dare write about a subject like this. And there was always a lot of pushback.
So what was that local reaction?
Yeah, there were a lot of people who weren't happy about it. So for instance, when I first conceived of the book project many years ago, I also thought, and this is just how my brain thinks, if I want to write about something, I want to teach about that thing. And so I thought the best way to get into writing about gun history is to teach a class on the history of guns in the United States. And so I did that for the first time. This was probably 2016, 2017. The students in the class, I tasked them with putting together a final project that would be some sort of campus presentation or some way to engage a campus community in a discussion. And they put together a survey in which they surveyed 1,000 students on campus about a whole range of gun questions and gun politics questions. And, the conclusions of the survey was that our campus tends to lean quite conservative in terms of its politics, in terms of its understanding of the Second Amendment. But the reaction, just the very idea that we were doing that, provoked some pretty scary reactions. Right away when that email went out, I got basically a threat emailed to us from a student who said, "You'll get my bullets before you get my guns," something to that effect. And so we had to have campus police investigate. And when we had the big event on campus, we had to have campus police there as well. So there was a lot of pushback, but the students in the class were always terrific. One of the things I think gun history does, and this is not something I had anticipated either, was the way it is, and I hate to use this sort of pun, it's disarming in the classroom to talk about gun debates in the 1780s and the 1790s. It takes you out of your contemporary understanding of guns and tries to put you into the shoes of policymakers in the 1790s and legislators and people writing a constitution and drafting a Bill of Rights who thought about the world very differently, right? They live in a different country than the country you live in. And so often today we tend to project back our own understanding of things like the Second Amendment back into the 1790s. And when you read the documents from the 1790s, you very quickly see that that doesn't make any sense at all. As a scholar, it's a weird question to think about because we love to learn. That's what we do. And so I don't have any sort of regrets about what I didn't know, but I do wish that I had appreciated the role of guns in my life when I was younger, before I became a professional historian. Because I was part of a gun culture, but I didn't embrace that gun culture. So, I grew up in New Jersey of all places, which is not a place you think about as a gun culture location. But, it was a rural part of New Jersey and people there, it's more like central Pennsylvania than it is like northern New Jersey. And there's lots of hunting. My friends all hunted. I didn't really hunt. My grandfather was, he would have been a self-described gun nut. He would have been a self-described right-winger. I grew up right next door to him. We lived next to each other. We were very close. And he would be listening to Rush Limbaugh out on his porch all afternoon, shouting at me about being a communist because I was going to college. He was a gun collector. He tried to bring me into gun culture. And, as a young person, I just sort of resisted that, in part because, I think the politics turned me off. I was enrolled in the junior NRA and those sorts of things, and I just didn't want anything to do with it. But the family joke was that, like, my grandfather was stockpiling guns because he was convinced the government was coming to take them. I wish I had known then how important guns would become to my professional life so many years later.
And you dedicate the book to him, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, the line is to my grandfather, who would have hated every word of it. I owe my interest in history to him, and this topic in particular, even though I think ultimately we would have disagreed on everything.
So I have a parallel story with my father, who was very conservative. He passed away in 2019. And so, researching conservative politics, researching gun politics, I'm often motivated by this question of what kind of conversation could I have had with my father about all of this? And I'm curious if the answer to that question has changed for you with respect to your grandfather over the course of the research for this book.
Yeah, it was always in the back of my mind. And I remember reading that in Merchants of the Right, and I thought of the very same thing and the relationship I had with my grandfather. And, the way in which it taught me, or I think he taught me, to appreciate gun owners and, even go further, like people we'd think of as whose politics are defined by guns, and the connection to, as you write about in Merchants of the Right, the connection to right-wing politics, their connection to conservative politics, to appreciate them as subjects, not as sort of objects in the background who...
And you should clarify what you mean by subjects, because gun rights people will hear subjects and say, I am not a subject. Right.
No, I mean, no, I'm thinking in terms of the way historians conceptualize subjects, in the sense that they have subjectivity, right? Mm-hmm. And that we understand them as individuals, as complex people with various motivations and thoughts and beliefs, not as the subjects of investigation. Although I guess in
subjects
this case,
of the
once
state.
again, right. Not an FBI or
citizens,
ATF
not subjects. Yeah,
right. That's right. But the idea that they have subjectivity and that is worth investigating. And I think, just because of the general sort of orientation of the politics of the historical discipline and the people who've written U.S. history for 50, 60 years, especially writing about early post-war history, that subjectivity was mostly written out. Though historians have gotten a lot better about it in the last couple decades. There's a rich literature now on conservatism in the post-war United States, taking those people as serious actors, as having a kind of subjectivity in ways that they would have been dismissed by early post-war generations as, rubes and anti-intellectual and so forth. My grandfather helped teach me to take their subjectivity more seriously.
So let's get into the meat of the book. So you say that we ought to conceive of our gun problem as a problem of gun capitalism. And I love this because I think, thinking about what you said about, teaching students, reaching out to different audiences, and, the disarming power of understanding history, I think so much gun history is really unraveling how what you think this history is about, it's actually about something else. It's not about, well, it is about guns, but it's also about gun capitalism. And so can you tell us what this means, what capitalism has to do with gun politics, and why does looking at gun capitalism necessarily root our current gun dilemmas in the post-World War II period?
Yeah, so it begins for me with just a very simple sort of statistical observation. And I'm not a statistics person. I'm not a quantitative person. I'm very much a qualitative person. But it is very easy to understand, or very easy to sort of conceptualize the growth of gun ownership in the United States in the post-war United States, right? So the book begins with that figure of the United States in 1945, at the end of the Second World War. There's about 45 million guns in civilian hands in the United States. 75, 80 years later, where we are today, there's probably 10 times as many, right? So the U.S. population has not increased tenfold in the last 75, 80 years. It's increased maybe 2.5 times. So how do we explain that material accumulation, that exponential growth of gun ownership in the United States. You can't explain it with the Second Amendment because the Second Amendment was always there. The Second Amendment was there in 1791 and the Second Amendment was there in 1945. So it's not as if the Second Amendment created this tremendous explosion of gun ownership. What did it? Market forces did it, right? Because that's how people accumulate guns. They do it through market mechanisms. And they do it through market mechanisms because our politics has enabled them to do it through market mechanisms, right? So many of our gun laws are written not to restrict gun ownership, but to protect the so-called law-abiding citizen, which is not to say that there are no law-abiding citizens. There are, of course, plenty of people who own guns who abide by laws, but that concept of the law-abiding citizen is a political construct that has shaped the way we write gun laws, and that has enabled the tremendous growth of gun ownership in the United States because it has provided guardrails in which gun capitalism can operate and in which the tremendous growth of ownership could take place. As a research question, I began with that incredible growth, 10 times as many guns in less than a century. How do we explain that? How does that come about? To me, it traces to the first two post-war decades, to the growth of the consumer market, to the tremendous prosperity of the United States in the aftermath of the Second World War, to a population of 15 million some odd veterans who become comfortable with firearms after the Second World War and are interested in purchasing them and engaging in recreation and so forth. And I write about the gun capitalists who I think enable that. There's a handful of them that really manage to exploit an underdeveloped source of guns, and that source is the bounty of weapons from the Second World War lying around in warehouses in Europe and Asia and just ready for somebody to swoop in and buy them up.
I love that you are focusing on the Cold War period because every time I teach a class on guns in America, oftentimes when I'm giving talks, I'll have someone, a student, someone in the audience, come up to me or raise their hand and say, you need to be thinking about this Cold War period. You need to think about, cowboy culture and the proliferation of toy guns and Red Dawn and all of these ways in which the Cold War sort of informs American sensibilities about guns. I think there's, like you said, there's not nearly as much history on this as we'd like. But I want to unpack what the Cold War does to informing people's politics, informing people's political imaginaries. And I want to start with this argument for why it makes sense that politically, in terms of the context of the Cold War, that the U.S. would become the dumping ground, basically, for surplus weapons. That part was really fascinating and was really not something that I had read or heard or thought about in any other context. And so can you just explain that sort of political sensibility?
Yeah, so after the Second World War, there is this flood of foreign war surplus firearms into the United States, brought in by this kind of cohort of really sort of ambitious and creative in some ways gun capitalists who figure out how to exploit this market. And they're bringing in millions of firearms. Most of them are rifles that had been used in the Second World War. Some of them are handguns that were either military surplus or cheaply manufactured. And later by the 1960s, especially by the second half of the 1960s, the handgun imports really take over, these cheap handguns that in part become a kind of urban social problem. But what that initial wave of imports does by the late 1950s is it provokes a political response. And that political response is going to come from, interestingly, the gun industry itself. So the first people who really lobby Congress after the Second World War for serious restrictions on the gun market are the gun capitalists themselves, at least the traditional ones in the United States, companies with names like Remington and Smith & Wesson and so forth. And they go to Congress and they say, these cheap imports are coming in. They are competing with our brand new nice hunting rifles. And if these cheap imports, which in some cases sell for as cheap as 10 or 20% of the price of a brand new nice hunting rifle made by Remington or Winchester, something like that, if they keep flooding in, they're going to put us out of business. And you need us in business because what happens when the Soviets invade? You need us to make firearms for the United States military. So military contracts for the gun makers are always it's a real sort of rise and fall thing for them. Every few years, they'll get a new big contract and they'll sell a few 100,000 rifles to the military, but then they go through lean times or they have no military contracts at all. And so their argument is you have to keep us on life support here. So you've got to eliminate this cheap market. Congress takes up the question. Fascinatingly enough, John F. Kennedy is the one who sponsors a bill in the Senate in 1958 to ban cheap war surplus firearms from coming into the United States. Cheap guns like the very one that will be used to kill him in 1963, a Carcano rifle that was made in Italy in 1940. This debate takes place in Congress, and they want to know what's going on here. For the most part, Congress has no idea about this market. They're even sort of baffled themselves. Like, where are these guns coming from? We had no idea that hundreds of thousands of rifles were coming from Italy and Germany and Great Britain and Spain and flooding into the United States. They had no idea that any of this was happening. And they ask a bunch of questions that lead them off in directions that really sort of go nowhere. They're thinking like, well, we've given a lot of people guns as a result of the Cold War. Are they coming back into the United States? And no, it's none of that. It's just guns left over in Europe from the Second World War. And so eventually they drag the State Department before Congress, and they want to know why the State Department keeps issuing all of these licenses for imports, because it is at this moment the State Department's responsibility to do that. They have a whole office, the Office of Munitions Control, that gets applications for gun imports, and they issue the licenses to bring those guns in. And they want to know why the State Department keeps doing that, because even the gun makers went to the State Department. They're like, you got to stop letting these guns in. This is going to kill us. And the State Department says, we don't want to have anything to do with economic competition. We are worried about national security. And they go to Congress and they say, in fact, it is good for our national security. This is our Cold War policy to allow, even to promote and encourage guns to come into the United States, because we don't want those guns to go elsewhere. We don't want those guns to fall into the hands of communist insurgents in North Africa or in Southeast Asia. We want those guns here where we can feel confident that they're going to be safe and they're not going to cause social and economic and political problems around the world. So the State Department's official Cold War policy towards guns around the world is bring them here, bring as many as we can into the United States. And so it's remarkable that the dramatic growth of this gun market after the Second World War, and I argue that it is really spurred by these imports because they're so cheap. They help expand the base for ownership. They encourage more people to come into gun ownership. They're sort of like the introductory level gun you buy and then you upgrade. It's like buying a cheap jalopy, and then later when you're older, you buy the nice Cadillac. This gun market is spurred by essentially American Cold War policy that is encouraging guns to come into the United States.
And that brings us to the Gun Control Act of 1968, which I think, at least from my perspective as, a criminological sociologist, I guess I could call myself, I think that the sort of way that this act is often understood is this is a response to political assassinations. This is a response to urban uprisings, increasing crime, and increasing sense of social upheaval. And, it's not really seen as a response to global gun flows. Can you tell us how bringing that dimension or that perspective into understanding this act, how it changes not just what the act does, but also how it sort of serves as a cautionary tale for federal gun restrictions? So this is something that you pull out in the book, really how this act was really never going to succeed, quote unquote, in the way that maybe people who were vehemently opposed to it and saw it as, the first of the slippery slope, that actually that's not at all what was going to happen with this act, precisely because of the way that it both controlled but also enabled global gun flows.
Yeah, that's right. So the Gun Control Act of 1968 doesn't make anyone happy because on the right, it smacks of a totalitarian slippery slope. And on the left, or at least among sort of liberals who are asking for more gun control in 1968, it simply doesn't work. At least it doesn't work in the sense that it doesn't reduce levels of gun violence and it doesn't reduce levels of gun ownership. In fact, in some ways, it helps to boost levels of gun ownership. And so I think the 1968 Act was very much an effort by Congress to attempt to build clear guardrails in which gun capitalism could take place. Because even its most prominent sponsor, who is Tom Dodd of Connecticut, would always say that we are here to respect the law-abiding citizen. We are here to make sure that legitimate gun commerce can take place. And our goal is just to keep the guns out of the hands of the wrong people, right? And so it's always the wrong people who are targeted by these laws, which is to say that the laws are written to protect gun ownership for the right people. By 1968, of course, the right people is a really kind of contentious issue. This is the era of Nixon's Law and Order campaign in 1968. And he adopts that from George Wallace, the arch segregationist governor of Alabama, who's the first one talking about law and order. And of course, that phrase law and order is a signal to that they will crack down on campus protests. They will crack down on Black uprisings in cities. And it's those Black uprisings in places like Newark and Detroit in 1967. It's 100 or more cities after King's assassination in 1968. That's ultimately going to help push the Gun Control Act over the finish line in the summer of 1968. It's King's killing, and then it's Bobby Kennedy's killing. And it's the fear that mass gun ownership among groups that are rebelling against the United States, that's what drags along those holdouts in Congress who otherwise weren't willing to go along with some new federal gun law, even as mild as the 1968 law was. And so it's those things that put the Gun Control Act over the edge in 1968. But this law goes all the way back in formulation to 1961, even 1963, even before Kennedy's assassination. And it's Dodd and Congress thinking about consumer markets. How are people accessing these guns? How are they crossing state lines? Who's importing them? How are they making their money? How are they exploiting loopholes in the law? They're always thinking about how to shape the law to enable legitimate gun commerce to take place and guarantee and protect the rights of the law-abiding citizen against the criminal, right? It's always sort of an imagined criminal. And so their way of doing it is to think about how to shape gun markets, not to restrict gun markets, but how to promote legitimate commerce in guns. I think every federal law, even all the way back to 1934, the Natural Firearms Act, 1938, the Federal Firearms Act, then we get the Brady Bill in 1993, we get the Assault Weapons Ban in 94. They are built on that model, which is to say that they are built to protect the market, to guarantee access to the market for the right people against the needs of the quote unquote wrong people.
So thinking about the centrality of consumerism as really shaping how it kind of opens the door for seeing gun markets as crucial in understanding our current gun predicaments, particularly just the sheer number of guns, but also in terms of thinking about the parameters that are implicitly placed on our politics in terms of what's possible and doable and feasible. And I want to, in a few questions, get back to the question of how consumerism really shapes the gun control movement. But one of the things that I really loved about this book, and there's many, many moments in this book where you kind of wave this flag and you're like, look, things could have been different, and they weren't. We had sort of a switch point, and this is the path we went down. And so even just having this reminder of, things could have been different is so powerful, even as it feels that we're very much trapped in the present moment. And one of the moments where you do this in the book is when you talk about the Civic Disarmament Committee. And Laura Fermi, am I saying her name correctly? Fermi, yeah. Okay. And this is, again, one of those moments where I think it's really powerful how Cold War politics is so crucial for understanding gun politics in the U.S. in a really interesting way. And so what you do is actually talk about how, you kind of want to rewrite the origin story of the U.S. gun control movement, right? You want to root it in a very different perspective, which is actually thinking about guns not as consumer objects to be controlled, but actually in the same sort of line as nuclear disarmament. So can you just give us like the 101 on Laura Fermi on the Civic Disarmament Committee and these scientist activists who basically said, look, if we can do it for, nuclear weapons, why are we not thinking in the same terms as for guns?
That's right. Yeah. So Laura Fermi is perhaps best known as the widow of Enrico Fermi, who was the scientist who cracked the atom at the University of Chicago in 1942. He's part of the Manhattan Project, one of the kind of leaders of the Manhattan Project. She was a brilliant scientist herself. She was a kind of a polymath in a number of ways, but also she married a Nobel Prize winning scientist. And so she sort of, her own kind of ambitions and work takes a backseat to him until he passes away in 1954 as a consequence of exposure to radiation that hadn't been anticipated, that sort of thing. And so her second life in that sense is as an activist. And it's first as an activist in the anti-nuclear movement. And then eventually by the late 1960s, she becomes interested in gun violence, and in particular gun violence in Chicago, right? Chicago is one of these iconic cities. When people talk about or complain about gun violence, they're often talking about the problems of Chicago. And nobody knew these problems better than Chicagoans in the 1960s because these problems were already there then. So she creates a committee, an activist group called the Civic Disarmament Committee in her neighborhood of Hyde Park, which is the neighborhood around the University of Chicago. And it is just filled with all of these brilliant women who themselves are scientists, and they're married to Nobel Prize winners and all these people who are doing these incredible things at the University of Chicago. And they want to address this problem of gun violence in their local community. But the way they conceptualize it is thinking about it in these kind of global humanitarian terms. These are people who experienced fascism in the 1920s and the 1930s and who fled Europe, who saw state violence directly, who saw societies collapse. And now they've moved to Chicago and they're seeing in a very kind of micro way societies collapse, violence on the streets. There's a incident for Laura Fermi when one of her young nephews, I think he's 12 years old, witnesses a shooting. And so this is like prompts her to say, I want to do something about this. And the way she thinks about the problem is in sort of abolitionist terms. If we can control the most dangerous weapons that human beings have ever created, nuclear weapons, why can't we do anything about $10 handguns? It's a perspective informed by sort of modernization theory after the Second World War, the idea that societies are supposed to develop along certain lines, particularly liberal democratic societies are supposed to develop along certain lines, and they're supposed to control the weapons of violence. And a society that can't do that, there's been some sort of aberration. It's gone wrong somewhere. And so we need a course correction. And for her, that course correction is you just have to get rid of the guns. And it's a perspective that is sort of short-lived because she's going to become essentially the founding mother, I guess, in a way, of what becomes the Brady campaign. That organization today, you won't find Laura Fermi's name mentioned anywhere on the Brady campaign's literature. They often point to a person named Mark Berinsky as their founder. Mark Berinsky was tutored by Laura Fermi. She taught him everything he knew about gun politics. And he went off to DC to create an organization that would eventually become the Brady campaign. But he can't do that without her teaching him everything she knows, without her committee funneling money and resources to him. She becomes the first board member of the Brady campaign. She's the only one donating any real money in the 1970s as they're struggling to get any funding. They're going up against not just the NRA, but all of these new gun rights organizations that are popping up, like the Second Amendment Foundation and so forth, that are just pulling in money. And they were, at the time, they're called the National Council for the Control of Handguns. They couldn't bring any money. They were struggling. They couldn't get anywhere. They hired a guy named Nelson Shields, who was a former DuPont executive, to come in and try and give sort of a business face to the organization. And Berinsky's approach is that we have to sort of triangulate the politics here. We've got to abandon Laura Fermi's vision of an abolitionist world, of a world without violence, of a world without weapons, because we're not going to get enough Congress people on our side. We're not going to get enough votes for that sort of thing. And so their approach turns away from let's control the tools of violence as any civilized society ought to do, to how do we build a counterweight to the NRA? And when that's your politics, it becomes about fundraising. It becomes about essentially marketing and media and communications and PR. And all of that was really a sort of turnoff for Laura Fermi. She eventually, by 1976, she's in bad health at the time, but she also tells them she doesn't want to have anything to do with the organization anymore because she doesn't like this turn they've taken, which is all about compromise. And in the world she comes from, a world informed by a war over fascism, over living in a fascist society, a world informed by trying to control the most dangerous things human beings ever created, you don't compromise. You fight for what you believe in. And she thinks that they become another DC lobbying group rather than something fighting for something real and important.
Yeah, and in the book, you make really clear that, there's a moment where this is imaginable that guns could be abolished, right? And a lot of that just relates to the sheer number of guns. And once we pass that point of no return, that is kind of over, right? And at the same time, though, at the end of the book, you do kind of you mentioned the term abolitionism, and you kind of say, abolitionism is a way forward, but you're talking about it, I think, in really different terms. Can you just describe to us how you're rehabilitating that term to think of how we can go forward in terms of our gun dilemmas?
Yeah, so when I use that at the end of the book, I'm not thinking so much of the abolitionism of Laura Fermi, though I guess there is some sort of roots there, but more so how abolitionists today talk about the abolition of state violence and the carceral state and that sort of thing. And I think so much of our gun problems today are tied up in the sort of industrial carceral complex, right? We put in prison more people than any other country in the world. So many of those people are in there because they've gotten mixed up in the illegal, illicit trade in guns and arms and so forth. And I think if we're going to start anywhere in imagining a world or a country without guns, and this is, as I say at the end of the book, this is a kind of pie in the sky thing, right? Because this isn't thinking as a practical political person today, well, what kind of society would I like to see? If we're going to get rid of the guns, we've got to start with the police, because police kill 1,000 or more people a year with guns. They are among the greater perpetrators of gun violence in the United States. And they are a reason that so many communities that are plagued by gun violence continue to stockpile guns, because those are communities that are desperate for jobs, they're desperate for economic opportunity, and they're getting mixed up in gang violence and drug violence. And they know that the guns protect them. And so I don't think any world in which the United States reduces its gun stockpile happens without disarming the police. And, again, this is talking about abolition and disarmament in the rather idealistic ways that a lot of people on the left today talk about it, which is not to say that it is a practical political goal today, but perhaps, thinking more about the sort of society we'd like to build. Our gun culture today, our gun society today, our gun country today is very much a product of contingency. It's not a product of inevitability. And historians always think about contingency. And so to think about the United States has always been a gun country is ahistorical thinking. It is to say that there is no change over time. And change over time is the foundation of historical thinking. So how has the gun country changed over time? And how might it change in the future? Today, we're stuck in a trajectory that goes back to the 1950s and the 1960s. And so if we want to imagine a society that looks very different, we're looking at a time frame that is 50 or 60 years in the future, not something that's going to be solved tomorrow by one piece of federal legislation or one particular state law or anything like that, but reimagining how we construct our society, how we build our societies. And that's a much harder thing to do and not something any historian is going to be very, very good at.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing the politics of police violence, police gun violence into the conversation, because it reminds us that what gets constructed as the problem of gun violence, the problem of guns, is a construction, right? It is often very much a narrowing, and also that it's contingent. And so one of the questions that this led right into one of the curiosities I had in terms of your book and sort of constructing this history of the gun control movement, the racial and gender politics of who gets to claim standing in the issue of gun politics is a pretty fascinating one. And so you write this, I would say, the mainstream history of gun control as consumer protection, right? And how this came to be, starting, of course, with the story of Laura Fermi. But you also kind of drop in these examples of other kinds of groups and organizations that were not able to really carry the banner of, the gun control movement because they weren't recognized as being part of the gun control movement, which, at various points was seen as, a lobbying group working in D.C., a group of, suburban housewives in suburban Chicago or what have you. And so I'm just curious, and this might, even be going beyond what you wrote about in the book, thinking again of contingency and thinking of these alternative histories of the quote-unquote gun control movement, thinking from the perspective of marginalized groups who are most directly impacted by gun violence, what can we take out of the historical archive to reconstruct the debate from that perspective?
It's a great question. And, I try to address it a little bit in the chapters on the gun control movement because in some ways, it's a kind of history of silences. It's a history of things missing from the archive, right? So I was able to reconstruct the early history of gun control in the 1970s through two groups, the Civic Disarmament Committee, as we talked about in Hyde Park, and another group in Chicago, which is the Committee for Handgun Control. And that group is, as you mentioned, those are the so-called suburban housewives. They describe themselves in that way because they know that that identity has a certain power in post-war United States. And those are two groups that they're wealthier, they're well-connected. When they decide that they're done with their work, they can go and they've collected all of their materials. They can bring them to a university archive. That university archive can process them and keep them there for historians to investigate years down the road. But when you focus on those groups, which are predominantly wealthy and predominantly white, you are missing the silences in the archive. So one of the groups that are mostly silent in the archive that I tried to reconstruct just a little bit, they call themselves the Concerned Women in a committee for the I'm gonna get this wrong. It's such a long, it's CCWWC, the Committee for Concerned Women in the War on Crime. And they're also operating in Chicago. There's a Black woman who's a journalist, and it's a group of Black women who are organizing, and they're working around the Chicago Defender, the Black newspaper in Chicago. And they are at once working for what we would talk about as gun control, but they're also working in communities that directly are plagued by these problems. Whereas Hyde Park is sort of an enclave where they're not directly affected by gun violence. The women of the North Shore are living in beautiful suburbs and beautiful homes and looking south to Chicago and saying, what can we do about this problem there? Well, these women in the Committee for the Concerned Citizens for the Women of the War on Crime, the CCWWC, they are living in these communities, and it's their families and their friends who are experiencing these things. But they also understand that gun violence is not in and of itself the problem. Gun violence is a symptom of a problem. And it's easier for wealthier white activists to say, well, gun violence is the problem. How do we address gun violence? These women are saying we need to address the problems that are causing gun violence. That is poverty. That's lack of opportunity. That's deindustrialization. That's the drug problems in our communities. That's gang violence. How do we address those problems? Nice neighborhoods in Hyde Park don't have gun violence because there are jobs there. There are wealthy people there. The North Shore suburbs don't have gun violence because they're wealthy white communities. So the problem isn't necessarily the guns. It's everything else that creates violence, and guns are a ready solution to the problem of violence and to the problem of conflict in neighborhoods where people are feeling desperate. And they're attuned to that, but they're not a group that's going to end up in the archive, just sort of given the nature of the way that archives are constructed. And so in some ways, it's like trying to reconstruct a history of something that is no longer tangible in the archive, right? So it's a history of silences and trying to find the silences in there and incorporating them into the story you tell. I tried to do that, but it was a hard thing to do, and I just don't know. I think other historians are better at it than I am. And I think there's still a history to be written there. And in some ways, I think at best my book is just sort of like an opening gambit. Like, here's some stuff we haven't looked at yet, and maybe people who are a lot smarter than me can go out and do that work.
I mean, a book that opens those kinds of questions, that's the best kind of book, right? A book that opens questions, opens new perspectives. So I wouldn't be so modest, but yes. So I want to kind of pull us into the present day and sort of kind of maybe spend a few moments just unpacking what your analysis can tell us about moving forward, reformulating how we think about guns and the politics of guns and the problem of gun violence. Have you heard of this company called Gunbusters?
Gunbusters. It sounds familiar. What is it?
So I'm going to tell you about it. So it is this company that, in a way, sounds like the market-based answer to all of the things that you unpack in your book, which is it's a company that sells a very specific service of destroying guns.
Yes, I did read the investigation of this.
Yeah,
Okay.
So they cater to police agencies. I believe that they also will take work from civilians looking to have their firearms destroyed. Basically, this sounds like a really ingenious way to sort of flip gun capitalism on its head. Anytime there's a market-based problem, people think, well, how do we pivot the market to provide a solution? But it's, of course, not so simple. So gunbusters, they destroy, quote unquote, the gun. But what is defined as a gun is, of course, defined by the Gun Control Act of 1968, which is the receiver. It's not the entirety of the firearm. And so what they actually do is they destroy the receiver and then they salvage them and sell them on the civilian market. So a really interesting twist on what the market can do in terms of ebbing and flowing the flow of guns. Yeah, it's not at all clear, obviously, that Gunbusters is really the market-based panacea that it seems to be on its face, at least. And so I'm curious what you make of that example. I'm curious where you see, I guess, part one is where you see the sort of flows of guns that we need to be thinking about now, given everything you've learned from your research. And also just this question of the market and whether, can the market solve the problems it creates? How do we think about the market as the problem versus the solution?
Yeah, when I read about Gunbusters, the thing it made me think of was the 1968 Gun Control Act, and not just because the 1968 Gun Control Act defines the gun as the frame or the receiver, right? That is what makes a gun, but the same way that the Gun Control Act of 1968 was supposed to be this sort of panacea, but proved because of this very loophole to be the opposite, right? So what happens in the aftermath of the Gun Control Act of 1968, which prohibits, among other things, the importation of all these cheap handguns into the United States, which are flooding, especially into cities in 1967 and 68. The growth in handgun purchases from the early 1960s to 1968 is just sort of incredible until the Gun Control Act. What it does is it essentially prohibits the importation of that receiver because it defines the receiver as the gun. And so we have these wily gun entrepreneurs in the United States who figure out precisely how to exploit that loophole, right? And so what they do is they can no longer import the receiver, but they can import everything else, just like Gunbusters takes everything but the receiver and puts it for sale back out on the market as a kind of kit or something like that. These entrepreneurs, these importers, will import all of the parts of the guns that they used to import whole, and then they'll just cheaply manufacture the receiver here in the United States out of some kind of cheap metal or something like that, and then they'll reassemble. This is the origins, or this is among the ways that we get these Saturday night specials, right? Which are by the late 1960s, these real sort of cheap handguns that are as likely to harm you as they are to harm anyone else. And so that's what I thought of with the Gunbusters thing. That, again, we have this law that is intended to address a problem, but just seems to encourage the market to find ways around it, right? And I think that's how I conceptualize the market more generally, that gun capitalism will always find a way. When your approach to gun policy is to privilege the law-abiding citizens' access to a legitimate gun consumer market, when you legitimize fundamentally the gun consumer market, gun capitalism is always going to find a way around whatever barriers you try to put up. And that's the great difference between the United States and so many other countries' gun policies, is that they do not recognize a gun market as fundamentally legitimate. And so it has so many restrictions, and it begins with the restrictions and opening up privileges to access guns rather than beginning fundamentally with an open market, which then needs to have guardrails built around it to enable law-abiding citizens to access those guns. And of course, anyone who's going to support that, the fundamental legitimacy of that gun market, is going to say, well, other countries don't have the Second Amendment. And that gets, of course, to the question of how we interpret the Second Amendment and how we've used the Second Amendment and marketed the Second Amendment and found a way to use that as a justification for gun consumerism. The Second Amendment doesn't mention any words like manufacture, distribute, market, sell. Keep and bear are the key verbs in there. And those are not verbs that are related to commerce. Those are verbs related to military functions, right? You keep, meaning you store and you maintain a firearm that you then bear in a military context. As Gary Wills famously said, one does not bear a rifle against a rabbit. It is a military conception, but we've done such a good job as a country in the last 50 years of transforming that understanding of the Second Amendment such that it is fundamentally about protecting the gun market, about protecting gun capitalism, something that didn't mostly exist in 1791. That is now fundamentally the function of the Second Amendment, to protect access to a consumer market, to guarantee those guardrails for gun capitalism to flourish.
This has been a sprawling conversation, and I really wish that I could just keep you for another couple of hours to ask more and more questions, but unfortunately we have to wrap up. What's the question we need to be asking about guns in society now, but aren't asking?
You know, it is the most perhaps pedestrian answer, but I think we need to go back to thinking about handguns. 75 to 80% of gun deaths every year are a consequence of handguns. The focus of the consumer market shifts in the mid-1960s. The marketing in particular of guns shifts to handguns. If we think of guns as a problem, then we have to focus on where statistically guns emerge as a problem. And as much as it is important to have conversations about things like the AR-15 and the militarization of gun culture and the militarization of the police state and all of these other things that activists tend to focus on, the mundane reality is that it is handguns that are doing the most damage in terms of harming and killing people. And I just don't know how to go back to that conversation. That's why I found Laura Fermi both so inspiring and also so kind of vexing, is like that was the conversation in the early 1970s. How do we abolish handguns? And it's incredible that that was part of the mainstream conversation about guns in the United States, is getting rid of handguns. That was, we didn't talk about, but such an important thing in 1968, alongside the Gun Control Act, is the Eisenhower Commission. It's this commission appointed by Lyndon Johnson to investigate gun violence, among other things, in the United States. And that's their conclusion as well, is if you want to do something about guns, abolish handgun ownership for civilians. That's where you have to start. They pointed to the numbers too, right? To come sort of full circle here to the question of numbers. They said at this moment in 1968, we probably have 25 million handguns in the United States. Now is the time to act. And we know if we were to act and try to confiscate those guns, it would be the greatest act of private property confiscation in the history of any liberal democracy. But if you don't do it now, 50 years from now, you're going to be looking at 200 million handguns. And they were right. And that is fundamentally the most sort of basic, mundane, everyday, quotidian problem of guns in the United States is handguns. And I don't think the solution is confiscating handguns, because that was the chance maybe 60 years ago. But I think it does have to be more of a part of our daily conversation about guns, because we get distracted by things like the AR-15, which is, when it comes to raising money for gun control organizations, whatever, it's sexier than talking about the everyday gun violence of handguns, which is more often responsible for our social disruptions and violence and so forth.
Yeah, and I think it's really compelling to think about not just the sheer number of handguns, really changing the conversation, but even, the public opinion drift on this issue with regard to supporting a ban on handguns. when you look at the 1960s and you look at public opinion data, there was still a conversation to be had. I think it was around 50-50 in terms of opposing versus supporting a ban on handguns. And now that number is somewhere around 3/4 of people in the U.S. oppose a ban on handguns. And that's way more than the number of people who even, own guns, who own handguns. And I think really reckoning with what that shift really means, especially given that the number one crime gun is a handgun. So, yeah, I think this conversation about handguns is definitely something that it's been avoided. And I think if we want to rethink the terms of the gun debate, it's something that we have to reckon with. So I really appreciate that. All right, last question. While we read your book, Gun Country, what are you reading right now?
The best advice I got in graduate school was to read widely, especially as I was writing my dissertation. And, the person I sort of admire, one of my advisors, he's written on a dozen different topics and kind of bounces around everything. So I'm always reading. I always have a small pile of books, and none of them are directly related to anything I'm working on at any particular moment. So I actually just finished Matthew Desmond's book, Poverty by America, which I thought was really compelling and really important. What else am I reading? So Jonathan Metzl's new book was fantastic. I finished that recently, What We've Become, which I think is can be a really important turning point for thinking about the gun control movement, because he does a very good job of critiquing the gun control movement to this point and the kind of public health focus. I also read lots of fiction because I have this strange idea that if I'm going to be a good writer, I just need to read lots and lots of good fiction. So, the nerd in me recently finished the third book in a series by a New Zealand author. Her name is Tasmin Muir. It's called the Locked Tomb series. It's about necromancers, which is not something I ever thought would be cool, but I was so absorbed in it. And there's 3 books in the series already and absolutely brilliant. I'm also reading at this moment, because I like to read comic books, thinking about different ways narratively to present stories. I'm reading Jean Luen Yang's Superman Smashes the Klan. So my reading tastes are all over the place. Maybe that's why I can't focus enough to get enough of my own writing done.
Thank you so much for joining us. I am just so thrilled that we got to have this conversation. And to everyone listening, if you haven't read it yet, go buy it, go read it. Gun Country, Gun Capitalism, Culture and Control in Cold War America. Thank you so much, Drew.
Jenny, thanks so much for having me. This was fantastic.
Thank you for listening. This has been Guns Unpacked, and I've been your host, Jennifer Carlson, the director of the Center for the Study of Guns in Society at Arizona State University. You can learn more about our center and all we do at csgs.asu.edu. Music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. This episode was produced by Regina Ravazova.